Hey guys. With what force I could muster, I rose to face God, the brightness of the sun obscuring both of our faces. I knew it was the God of my mistress, whom she called Yahweh. But if I was to be the mother of a nation, I would need to give this God a new name. You are a God who not only hears, but also sees, I said, surprised by the strength in my voice. I have seen the one who sees me. My faith, like Abraham's, was tested. But my faith, unlike the patriarchs, was not immortalized in Caravaggio's reds or Chagall's blues for later generations to view, nor was it remembered in the litany of Hebrews or in the genealogies of your New Testament. Yet just one person in all your sacred scripture dared to name God, and it wasn't a priest, it wasn't a prophet, and it wasn't a warrior, and it wasn't a king. It was I, Hagar, foreigner, woman, slave. Don't you dare forget. That's a quote from my favorite author and theologian, Rachel Held Evans, as she examines the life and legacy of Hagar. Hagar lived a life relatable to those who are oppressed and feeling hopeless, yet her redemption is quickly dismissed as just another life lost in the morally confusing injustices committed in the Old Testament. A servant to Sarai, later Sarah, and an Egyptian slave in a foreign land, she is forced to have sex with an elderly Abraham out of the couple's unbelief that God could bear them children even in their old age. It's not a fun way to start anybody's story. In most understandings of the text, the story goes something like this. Hagar had no choice but to marry Abram. She gets pregnant with a child, and once pregnant, she begins to be disrespectful to Sarai. Many versions of the Bible say she looked to or treated her mistress with contempt. Others say she began to despise her mistress. Rabbinic tradition holds that Hagar stated, "My mistress Sarai is not inside what she is outside. She appears to be a righteous woman, but she is not righteous. Had she been a righteous woman, see how many years have passed without her conceiving, whereas I conceived in one night." Because of the favor that God had shown her, Hagar became prideful and rude. She clings to an identity that would have given her some kind of control of her situation, which is a relatable struggle for anyone who's gone through a traumatic event. That behavior, however, did not warrant what Sarai chose to do next. She blamed Hagar's new disrespectful behavior on Abram, and when Abram, attempting to get a rise out of Sarai, told her to, quote, deal with her as Sarai sees fit, Sarai chose to abuse Hagar. The author of Genesis doesn't explain explicitly what happened to Hagar, but we know it was bad enough for her to run away. Pregnant and afraid, wandering alone in the wilderness, an angel of the Lord found her. Not just any plain old angel. I would argue to say that this is the first time Jesus shows up in the Hebrew Bible. Listen carefully to how he speaks to her, and Jesus will reveal himself in the words that the angel says. He opens with a question. He calls her by her name, and he asks her where she's going and where she's come from. Succinctly, she says she's running away from Sarai. The angel then tells her to go back to your mistress, put up with her abuse. And then he tells her, and this is a quote, I will give you more descendants than you can count. He continues on to prophesy about the birth of her son, who will have many descendants, as he promised Abram, and names him Ishmael, which means God hears. Then Hagar looks at the Lord who spoke to her and calls him by a new name. El Roi, she says, God of sight, have I truly seen the one who sees me? After her encounter, she names the well that she spoke to the Lord at and returns to Sarai and Abram. This small story out of our scriptures is about a strong human being wronged by those who should be guided by God only to do right, witness God herself, and choose to walk back into the situation. Consider how Hagar reacts to suffering, particularly suffering that is cast on her by those who are considered righteous and upright people of God. Don't place yourself in the position of Sarai in this story. even though I'm positive that everyone in this room has inflicted harm on another, myself included. Just for a moment, see yourself as Hagar. In the beautiful literary work of the Bible, Hagar is a perfect example of how God redeems. God promises that through Hagar, her son will also be a great nation, but she has to endure the abuse for right now. God plays the long game. I often find myself wishing that the broken things in this world could be fixed. I wished that the oppressed would find justice and that the oppressors would have to face it. But Hagar's patient, unlike me. She knows that she will see justice through her son, even if it doesn't happen in her lifetime. God's goodness in that moment and his promise for a future were enough for her. Just to be heard and seen were enough for her. When things happen in your life, do you guys ever just look back on them and think, that couldn't have been anything but the God who sees me? I have many of those moments, and in retrospect, the things that happened couldn't have been anything other than God. And the way that they happened proved that he is El Roi, the God who understands and the God who knows. This story is important personally to me, as there have been many times when God has taken me out of or turned the tide on situations that required so much nuance to understand. But this story is also important to whole communities, most notably African American women who were enslaved, painfully anticipating freedom, not only for themselves, but also for their sons and daughters. It's so vital when reading this story to notice how God acknowledges Hagar's humanity. In the most dehumanizing of situations, God says her name. That's an acknowledgement of her humanity. It was so important for those women back then, and it's very important for us to hear now. Hagar shows us how to respond to God. Alone, afraid, and in an unknown place, Hagar encounters God after abandoning all that she knows, understanding that this world is broken. It's not supposed to be this way. In this vulnerable state, God finds her. He says her name. He kindly asks her what's happened and directs her on the path that she should go, telling her that he is looking out for her and that he has her back. That's our God. We see God in the high places, yes. When you're on top of the world and you can't help but thank God for all the wonderful things he's given you. He's a God of goodness and a God of mercy and a God of grace. He is worthy of our praise. But never forget that God also draws close to us in the low places. When we're longing for redemption and escape from the terrible burden that our own sin and the sin of others may put on us. He's a God of justice and a God of rescue and a God of freedom. Those aren't just Christian buzzwords. He calls your name. He sees you. He knows what has happened to you and what will happen to you, and he will never leave you. He's the God who knows. As the psalmist says in Psalm 139, "For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made." In light of God seeing us, we must acknowledge that his goodness and his promise are enough for us. But we aren't the only seen and loved people in this world. Accept your belovedness, behold God, and if you take anything away from this, let it be the golden rule: love your neighbor. If God knows and loves you, he certainly knows and loves others too. We may not be slaves to Sarai, but we certainly can't live like slaves to hatred in a cycle of violence anymore with a God that is this compassionate and corrective. We are commanded in 1 Peter 2:16-17 to live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. Hagar acknowledges that God knows the depths of her soul. He has seen her, and he has told her to walk back into the abuse she suffered being a slave to Sarai with the future glory of redemption in mind. We must live like Hagar, who is no longer a slave to Sarai, but a slave to the God who sees, directs her steps, and tells her to return home. We live as free people, not in a way that covers up evil, but in a way that also acknowledges that we are God's possession. Show others respect. Know that God sees you and He loves you. He is the God who knows. Accept your belovedness, your humanness, your freedom. Behold the God that beholds you, and love your beloved and beheld neighbor. Thank you.